Thank you so much, Prof. And we're looking for more deliberations with those many questions that you challenged us with during your remarks. Now we're getting to another exciting part of the conference. We're going to go straight into the keynote session, and the theme for that is AU and the New Scramble for Africa. Okay, still conflict, reparations, and resource conflict, but the chair for this session is our very own executive director from Trust Africa in Dakar, Senegal. But we do have Dr. Ibrahim A with us, and he will be chairing the session. Can we please give him a round of applause?
Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege and an honor to be standing in front of you here today, following the book launch we had yesterday evening at the university and the opening speeches we've had. I think there isn't much to add to the background and to why we are here today. I think we've been challenged by the various speakers, to rise to the occasion. Right? The continent is challenged to rise to the occasion. From what the UN General Assembly, the UN Secretary General has been saying, as Ambassador Jerry reminded us here, and what the introductory speeches have said. My role in this session is a simple one, but I'll begin just by saying that I think the links between the scramble, we're talking about the new scramble, because it's not the first one. We've had the scramble for people, for territories, for resources that have been going on for a long time. Okay, and then now we are seeing it taking new forms, intensifying in ways probably that it hadn't taken previously. So we are in a context of a scramble again. And it is also a context in which we also see what this has always done. This scramble had led to conflicts, international wars, tearing societies apart. And we are seeing exactly the same things happening in parts of the continent again today. Now, the context in which we are reclaiming our agency. I think the point was made by our colleagues from AUDA. We are discussing the legacy of the previous scrambles, what that has done to the continent, the extraction of resources, the insertion of Africa in a global system in a way that sort of didn't work for us so far. The multilateral system has worked for us really in a very limited way. To a large extent, it has been very problematic for us. So there's a need to re-examine that, renegotiate our relationship with the rest of the world, we've seen how the issue of reparations has been taken up by the African Union in a much more important and determined way now. 20 years ago, when the Durban Conference was convened here in South Africa on racism, the Latin Americans, particularly the Caribbean brothers and sisters, came with that agenda of reparations, and the African Union didn't respond really. The African presidents, actually some of them called, this is straight from the main proponent, Hilary Beckless, who was reminding everyone of this. It's in a chapter of a book that was produced not so long ago, last year, but he also was saying it himself in Accra about 3-4 weeks ago. That he was called by a couple of African heads of state and said, hey, look, forget that issue of reparations. The Europeans don't like it, and we are going with the Europeans. And now it's now realized that actually it was a bad idea not to take it up. And it's good that the African Union is taking it up fully, because it's about righting past wrongs, getting acknowledgement of the fact that Africa has been subjected to injustices, right? A whole series of injustices, and they are continuing, okay? So because they are continuing, it's also about stopping those injustices now, stopping the bleeding of African resources from the continent, the scramble and so on, illicit financial flows, resources, precious minerals, land, and, we had it all. But it's also about creating the basis for reparative futures, just futures, futures in which the wrongs that have been committed, those kinds of wrongs will not happen anymore. And that is why it is important to connect all these dots, interpretations. And we have nobody really who is much better placed than our keynote speaker to speak to these issues and introduce the topic, and then he'll be followed by the panel. His bio is in the program, but I think it's just important to summarize it a little bit. We cannot speak to all the things that he has done. Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki is a former foreign minister and former Prime Minister of Niger, and he was the CEO of NEPAD AUDA, lived here in South Africa for many years and led that great organization. He currently serves as the African Union Special Envoy for Food Systems, and he's in that role since 2023. He's done many, many other things before, CEO of several agencies, and did quite a lot. But he is also a scholar. I think that's what I want to emphasize. We have in front of us somebody who has experience addressing issues concretely as a senior government official, as a lead government official before having been a prime minister, in a context that's extremely difficult. Right? One of the Sahelian countries, and you know, when you say Sahel, it invokes a lot of things already, just Sahel. It's extreme ecological conditions. Okay? It is a zone where the most intense of conflicts are taking place on the continent today. It's also a place where you have all these things we are talking about, precious resources, uranium in Niger. So he's been dealing with those issues as a policymaker. Before becoming a policymaker, he was a scholar, and he's again back into scholarship. So here is somebody who can connect the dots, who can speak with experience gained from different angles. And I think it's a privilege to have him here. He traveled all the way from Paris, a 12-hour journey, to join us here in Johannesburg. We welcome Dr. Mayaki, and thank you for honoring us with your presence here. You have the floor.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Sal, for these very kind words. By the way, I also worked 10 years in the Niger uranium industry. I mean, it was a small parenthesis. So, Excellencies, distinguished scholars, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking the organizers and the supporters and the leadership of the University of Johannesburg and Trust Africa for making this symposium happen. I think it comes at a very critical moment when policymakers throughout the continent have the necessary tools to allow them to reflect, but the reflection regarding the use of these tools needs to be adapted to the current context in which we are, because the context has been speedily changing in the last few years, and the last 10 years, the last 5 years, and the last 2 years. So I'm really honored to deliver this keynote at this third African Union Studies Annual Symposium. Let me recall the theme: African Union and the New Scramble for Africa, Conflict, Reparations, and Resource Sovereignty. There are critical words in that theme. Scramble, conflict, reparations, and sovereignty. The reflection is both urgent and timely, and let me begin with a question that shapes my own reflections. Why are we talking about a new scramble for Africa? And I think mainly it's because, evidently, of a new context But it's also because we have a higher consciousness of what scramble means today. So we could have been used to defining the scramble in the terms that we historically know. But today, we have a special consciousness of what it means in terms of impact on our population, our institutions, and our future. And understanding the meaning of scramble helps us recognize evidently, and it's redundant, but Africa has already experienced previous periods of dispossession and contestation. We know about the colonial scramble, but for me, the colonial scramble, beyond the issue of extraction of people and resources, was also a shifting of our own identity. And we are still, beyond the legacy of fragility and fragmentation, we are still living a displacement of identity. And we need to reconquer that identity. So it's not only about development, it's also about culture. And I personally humbly think that this is a very important point. The post-colonial scramble, which was consequent, among other things, to the structural adjustment era, imposed externally by the Bretton Woods institutions, such as the World Bank and IMF, designed economic reforms that weakened African state capacity and deepened dependency. And yesterday, when we were talking about Agenda 2063, Agenda 2063 came at a moment where we ceased to think that we were intellectually reliable to these type of economic reforms, and we set an agenda that was a transformative agenda. And remember, the structural adjustment was saying, forget about state capacity, markets will solve it all. And through markets, you will be able to reduce extreme poverty. And we adhered to that thinking without looking at China, which was reducing extreme poverty through strong state intervention. And it's quite interesting to see that most of Asian countries, all of them, didn't abide by the norms of the World Bank and the IMF. They didn't apply the structural adjustment processes, but we did. And one of the consequences of the structural adjustment processes was to have a huge impact on our social indicators. And then came something which was invented by the UN and the world community, which was poverty alleviation. So we moved to the weakening of a state capacity, imagining that markets would solve the issues. They didn't. We faced strong social consequences. And in order to remedy these social consequences, we are proposed and we adhered to poverty alleviation strategies. Poverty alleviation. And evidently, when you have a poverty alleviation strategy, you are not thinking about wealth creation. And it determines the way you plan nationally, regionally. And there also we need to recognize that Agenda 2063, as we mentioned yesterday in the book, is a critical cut from that type of thinking. But in each one of these phases of scramble, Africa did resist. Colonial scramble, post-colonial scramble, structural adjustment, poverty alleviation strategies, Africa did resist. It did resist with its civil society, and it did resist with its academia. And I think we should recognize what our scholars have been alerting us to do from quite a long time, since the 60s. But the connection between the scholars and the policymakers was not strong enough in order to allow policymakers to readjust their mindset. Remember, that displacement of identity had a long-term consequence. So the scholars did fight against the scramble, and they are now providing us with new ideas in order to fight against a new scramble, which is underway. Its drivers differ, but the risks remain quite significant. And it's mea culpa, which I'm going to do. You know, my country, Niger, is the third producer of uranium in the world. The kilowatt hour, the cost of a kilowatt hour in France is the lowest in Europe. The price of a kilowatt is the lowest in Europe. And Niger has been providing for 40 years 2/3 of the inputs of the civil nuclear industry of France, which means that we have been subsidizing at a very low cost, because uranium was bought at a very low cost. We have been subsidizing the cost of electricity in France, and we still have more than 50% of our population, depending on the figures, but let's say 60, which doesn't have access to electricity. And all of us policymakers who have been in this process are responsible of this situation. And then comes the issue of consciousness. Consciousness allows us to look at this global picture and start saying, it's enough, it needs to change. It needs to change. And that will, motivation, intention for change is what will really limit the new scramble ahead. So what did the government of Niger did? They nationalized the uranium industry, and we still are battling legally with 2,000 tons of uranium, which we call yellow cake, which cannot get out of Niger, but we'll find a way to solve that out. But remember this image. A country produces uranium to another developed country, which has the lowest cost of electricity, and it produces more than 70% of its input for its nuclear civil industry. So this is a remarkable, if I can use that word, a remarkable example of scramble. Now, if there is one thread running all through these scrambles, I think it is the theme of governance. And I'm very happy to see my dear brother, Professor Maloka here. And governance, as reflected in the APRM concept, and I would like to mention one thing that we tend to forget. The essence of NEPAD is governance, based on the African paradox that President Obasanjo and Beki identified. Governance is the basis of the new Partnership for Africa's Development. So APRM is the essence of a NEPAD program. And, but governance is as we talk about it, is different from the concept of good governance that was promoted by the UN and the multilateral agencies. Good governance signification of good governance was that the norms, the rituals, the bureaucratic processes, the Weberian type of thinking was not rightly applied in our political structures, in our administrative structures. We needed to do better. That was the spirit of good governance. We needed to be good students in terms of governance. But good governance is not the definition that governance has within the APRM. In the APRM, governance is linked to development. The governance institutions that we have help us develop better. And I will come back on the concept of development later. And governance challenges do persist, and we see it at travers the multiplication of conflicts across the Sahel, the Horn, the Great Lakes, Libya, Mozambique. And there is a point that we all need to be aware of, because we are somehow all part of an elite. It happens because of elite complicity, and corruption facilitates resource plunder. And institutions often lack the autonomy and capacity to resist external pressure. Extraction has an impact on the types of institutions we are dealing with. I will not do a development on Asemoglu and extractive institution versus inclusive institutions. But the extractive institutions are closely linked to corruption. Inclusive institutions tend to fight against corruption. And in the heart of this problematic is the role that the elites are playing. But we know that governance is not solely an African issue. It is the arena where the current scramble unfolds. So conflict and scramble, because I'm going through each one of the segments that were given to me for this presentation. Evidently, conflict in Africa cannot be separated from the resource question. In the Sahel, we see armed groups, traffickers, external powers intersect in a deadly competition for control of territory and resources. And I would like here to make a small parenthesis on an example which I lived. When I was Prime Minister 25 years ago, we entered the negotiation with Exxon, the oil company, for the extraction of oil in the east of Niger. So my team prepared talking points, and most of the talking points were not about the technicalities of the negotiations itself, because this was easy. They were more about how we could present to the CEO of Exxon that the insecurity that we faced in that region, we were able to deal with it. And so the scene is quite interesting. So we come as a team, we meet the Exxon CEO with his team, we start talking about the operationalization of oil extraction, etc. And then we go straight to the security issue, trying to convince him that, we can deal with insecurity. These are the measures that we are put in place. He stops me and he says, Mr. Prime Minister, insecurity is not an issue for Exxon. We know how to deal with it. Let's go straight to the contractual arrangements. But whatever insecurity you have, I mean, we deal with it. We have instruments, we have a know-how, we have a people. Well, we have seen it in Mozambique, we have seen it in Angola, etc. So what does that example give us? It tells us that wherever conflicts exist, you have a scramble because the companies are not worried about the conflicts. So it's an important point. They are not worried about the conflicts because they think they can solve it. They have, the private security companies. They have the strength to do it, and they can use many resources to solve it. So conflicts is not an issue for external powers. It's something that we should integrate. Conflict is a problem for us, it's not a problem for them. And the same thing happens in the Sahel. In Niger, we are fighting what we call jihadists who are not jihadists because they don't even know what the Quran is. And we had the biggest US drone base in Agadez, in the north of Niger. The biggest drone base in Africa. 500 drones. With 500 drones, they could cover, with a CIA installation, they could cover all the continent. And since they could cover all the continent, they could cover all the Niger territory. But we are facing jihadists with motorbikes. And the difference in terms of timing between the information we had of movements of jihadists and our capacity to react, that difference was never filled by the external forces that we had, whether French, Americans, and so on. And this is why, it's another parenthesis, we decided to ask them to leave. So we don't have any external troops today, whether they are French, whether they are Americans, no external troops. And the insecurity has not increased. So I come back to the idea that I flagged. External powers are not worried about our conflicts. And Sudan is a good example. We are the one who should be worried about our conflicts. And when we understand that, and the African Union has understood it, and is moving towards that, notably with its peace and security framework, once we understand that, we react differently. We get at another level of understanding of how the world is working and how we are looked at by the world. In DRC, well, every one of us has a part of DRC in its phone. We know that. But DRC doesn't have a part of what we doesn't benefit of the part that we have in our phones. It's an example that we all know. And if you look at it carefully, the governance, and I think we are in Chatham House rules here, aren't we? Huh? So if we look at it, stability has never existed in DRC since the killing of Lumumba. I go back to my point, which is that external powers are not worried about conflicts. But the plundering of DRC has been going on and has been increasing amidst the continuous instability. So we should draw a lesson from that. We should do a lesson from that, because that lesson can help us think better about our frameworks, our integration processes. So scramble is not only economic, it is also militarized, violent, undermines sovereignty. And the less we have sovereignty, the more plundering do exist. So sovereignty becomes a critical part of the way we should look at these issues. Now, on reparations and historical justice, as Dr. Sall mentioned, the African Union has declared 2025 a year of reparations and recognition for people of African descent. Next week, I'm in Madrid for a conference we call Afro-Madrid, which will gather all African descendants, South America, North America, and Europe, in order to discuss about reparations and recognition for people of African descent. So the main leitmotif should be an affirmative declaration that it has to be recognized. And once it is recognized, we give a moral dimension, much more than a material dimension, to the question of reparation. Dr. Sall mentioned it, so much, but who is going to pay, who is going to benefit? But the question is not who is going to pay and who is going to benefit. The question is that there is a void, a total void. And that total void, in terms of reflection on the reparation, has mindset consequences. And it has very simple consequences, as in the content of the books, of the history books of our primary school students. So it's a fundamental issue that needs to be taken on. But at the same time, meaningful reparations require first addressing our own internal challenges. And reparations must be grounded in accountability, internal unity, and without this, they risk becoming symbolic rather than transformative. The aim of looking at reparations has to be transformative for the future. And the case is compelling. I will not go through the centuries of slavery, colonial plunder, contemporary patterns of extractivism, climate injustice, etc. But the reparations will gain traction only if Africa presents a unified position supported by credible institutions and moral legitimacy through our internal reforms. And Agenda 2063 provides a basis for this internal reform. And a common position will evidently come out of the next African Union Summit, which will certainly adopt a position on that. And that position, I think, has to be one of the most important positions of the last 10 years and of the next 10 years, because it's a mindset issue. Now, on resource sovereignty, I would like to say that it extends beyond national ownership of oil, gas, or minerals. It includes rights and consent over resource exploitation, adding value locally instead of exporting raw materials. Remember, in the structural adjustment processes, the economic model was about export-led growth. We are latecomers in industrialization. That model of export-led growth is not the model that can help us create 20 million jobs per year in the next 20 years. So we need the CFTA, but we need industrialization. And in that industrialization, we need to promote a critical instrument, which are small, medium enterprises. 80% of Africa's economy is informal. Most of this informal economy is driven by micro, small, and medium enterprises. And these are the strength that we have. Once we move them in a context where we think that formalization is a win-win strategy, then we can boost industrialization, and that industrialization will increase our intra-Africa trade. So it's not about an export-led growth model. It's about constructing our economic integration and counting on our own resources. And evidently rejecting exploitative contracts, talked about it in the case of Niger, and debt diplomacy. And in that case, the CFTA plays a central role by creating a continental market, enabling Africa to leverage its resources for its own transformation rather than solely for global supply chains. And the critical point and message I would like to highlight here is that given our demographic growth rates between 3.8 and 4.2, in a medium-sized African country of 20 million inhabitants, where 70% of the population lives in rural areas, on the employment market every year, you have between 250,000 and 300,000 cohorts of young coming for an employment. And let us not forget, we have still a high percentage of our population in rural areas whose main activity is agriculture. It's true, we have an urbanization process which is quite important, but the transformation of our food systems will be key in order to boost our industrialization. And it has to be regional and continental. There it allows me to focus on one critical aspect of the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference had an economic objective. It was not the objective of, politically dividing Africa so that each colonial power could, manage its territory. No, the economic objective was the more we are fragmented, the better we can plunder. The more we are fragmented, the better we can plunder. So we cannot pursue with the fragmentation, and that's why the CFTA is extremely important. To stop plundering, we need to integrate and stop the fragmentation, which is the highest obstacle that we have for development. So conflicts, reparations, and resource sovereignty are deeply interconnected and should not be addressed in isolation, but systemically. Conflicts thrive where sovereignty is weak. I repeat myself. Reparations demand legitimacy rooted in institutions, and resource sovereignty is a foundation for peace and dignity. And for this reason, the African Union must be thought, imagined as more than a bureaucracy, and we said it yesterday. it should serve as a political project for emancipation. We had the OAU, which was geared by political liberation. But that dimension of political liberation has to be pursued with the African Union. We cannot say that with the African Union, we have ended the pursuit of political liberation, we should move to economic development, etc. No, we should continue in that political emancipation. And if we have that thinking of continuing in political emancipation, then we can draw the right frameworks and the right strategies and the right development systems. So in response to all of this, I propose 3 imperatives: secure peace through sovereignty, redefine partnerships by engaging global powers from a position, global and emerging powers, from a position of strategic interest and not supplication. In the current world in which we are, Africa doesn't have friends. We have partners and we have our interests. Once the romantic period where we thought that, friends could help and support, that romantic period has ceased. We don't have friends. Once we realize that we don't have friends, we get to the fact that we have interests. So first of all, it's our interests which count. And on the basis of our interest, we can establish the partnerships we want. But it's not on the basis of friendships because we don't have friends. We go to find friends, quote and unquote, on the basis of the interest that we have identified. That's the critical point with any partner. And speak with one voice on reparations. Like the quest for reparative justice to climate justice, debt justice, and fair trade. And there you will see also that, you take the COPs on climate and you take the Green Fund, the promises of $100 billion every year, which was never accomplished. I think we should forget about these promises which are never accomplished. Well, forget is not the term. We should remind those who promise, but they don't deliver, and we should work on mobilizing our own resources internally, and I think it's important. The scramble is not inevitable. I am fully convinced that we can transform this moment into renewal, shifting from the object of global competition to the subject of our own history. And the African Union, supported by academia, and I insist a lot on that, because scholars have to play a critical role in shaping the mindset and giving the tools to the policymakers. Academia, civil society, progressive leadership must meet this challenge. That is when future generations, when they look back, will say Africa did not allow itself to be scrambled again. It claimed its sovereignty, secured justice, built a future of dignity and peace with an equal share of a global decision-making table. And just an anecdote, going backwards, in Niger in 1999, we did a survey, very rigorous scientific survey, before elaborating a national plan. And in that survey, our planning ministry was asking to the populations, what are your priorities? All of us a bit technically stupid. We thought that the answers would be water, road, sanitation, health programs, etc. And in all the regions of Niger, guess what came first as an expectation? It was justice and dignity. So what our populations, what Africans want is justice and dignity. And that justice and dignity evidently needs to be based on access to electricity, access to water, access to sanitation. But all these things which are technical, we know how to do them. We know how to build bridges, we know how to build roads, we know how to build healthcare services. We know technically how to build these things. The question is, how can we politically leverage, install, promote justice and dignity? I thank you.